We'll hear from our co-sponsor, Dr. Nader Hashemi, on the democratic peace theory revisited, reflections on the end of the Arab Spring and the rise of ISIS.
What I want to talk about is an idea that is widely recognized and acknowledged, but sometimes ideas that are popular and that have deep resonance around the world, there is value in reminding us of the importance of those ideas. And I want to make that argument in the context of the relationship between the rise of ISIS and the crushing of the Arab Spring revolts. So there's a long-standing and widely recognized relationship between democratic societies and violence. The two are inversely related. The more that democracy advances in the form of political accountability, political representation, the rule of law, political transparency, and the peaceful transfer of power, the less the likelihood of violence. This is a variation of the famous democratic peace theory that recognizes that democratic societies are more internally peaceful and less likely to go to war than their non-democratic counterparts. This is one of the key lessons of history that has been proven over time and is rarely challenged these days, which is why even the most extreme authoritarian regimes like to claim that they represent the voice of the people, hence the term the People's Republic of China and the Democratic Republic of North Korea. There is bragging rights that go along with the term democracy. Now, this relationship between democracy and violence, I think, is highly relevant in terms of understanding the key themes of this conference, exploring the connections between democracy, authoritarianism, and radicalization. And I want to comment on this relationship with specific reference to the rise of ISIS and the crushing of the Arab Spring revolts. I think the timing and the sequencing of these events in the Middle East is not accidental, and there are lessons here to be learned for those who choose to heed them. Now, observing the general turmoil in the Middle East today, it's easy to forget that only a few years ago the region looked quite different. The 2011 Arab Spring brought hope to the people of the region and indeed to the entire world that a brighter political future was on the horizon. Starting in North Africa and moving in quick succession across the Middle East, pro-democracy revolts swept three long-standing dictators from power and came very close to toppling two more. The Arab Spring revolts shook the foundations of Middle Eastern authoritarianism while capturing the imagination of the entire world in the process. Sadly, those days have passed. Now, it's interesting is to look at Al-Qaeda's response to the Arab Spring uprisings. Al-Qaeda was shocked by this turn of events that produced ideological confusion and organizational incoherency within the heart of the radical Islamist project. In an important study published by the Combating Terrorism Center at West Point, entitled Jihadi Discourse in the Wake of the Arab Spring, the authors note that that as a result of the Arab Spring, Salafi jihadi groups were both impotent and unpopular. Rather than being participants in shaping these events, they were distant observers. The Arab Spring revolts produced ideological confusion and incoherency among these extremist organizations. The reasons for this are self-evident because for a moment, it appeared that political change could be achieved via peaceful protest rather than violent revolution. This undermined one of the central ideological claims of Al-Qaeda, which had long argued that the only way that dictators could be removed was via armed revolution and violent jihad. Democratic elections and nonviolent protests could never work. As Ayman al-Zawahiri put it, quote, "What is truly regrettable is the rallying of thousands of duped Muslim youth in voter queues before ballot boxes instead of lining them up to fight in the cause of Allah." End quote. As a result, the ideological appeal of radical Islamist militancy during the Arab Spring months fell precipitously throughout the Arab Islamic world. Now, the political gains, as you all know, of the Arab Spring have been rolled back. Tunisia is the one outlier, and they've been rolled back as a direct result of the counter-revolutions that were launched by the previous ruling elites, by their deep states, and their regional allies, primarily Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, who have been financing these counter-revolutions. The promise of political change and the doors to democratization have been firmly slammed shut. And as a direct result of this development, there has been a qualitative increase in violence and extremism across the region. This demonstrates yet another important relationship that is central to the politics of the Middle East today, that when democratic openings are closed and moderate forms of political Islam are crushed, radical Islam thrives as a consequence. The case of Egypt after the 2013 military coup is a perfect illustration of this point. General Abdel Fattah el-Sisi came to power by toppling Egypt's first democratically elected president, Mohamed Morsi. The backdrop to his seizure of power was an orgy of violence that Human Rights Watch described as, quote, a likely crime against humanity and what may have been the single biggest killing of protesters in modern history, end quote. The reference here is to the Rabaa al-Adawiyya massacre on August the 14th, 2013, that killed at least 1,000 people in downtown Cairo in a couple of hours. These events unofficially brought to an end the Egyptian democratization process that began with the ouster of Hosni Mubarak in February 2011. Since then, there has been a qualitative and significant increase in violence and political extremism across the country, mostly in the Sinai, but in other places in Egypt as well. In the 22-month period since the July 2013 coup, there have been more than 700 attacks across Egypt. That is to be compared with the 90 attacks in the previous 22 months before the coup d'etat. Human Rights Watch has reported a figure of 41,000 political prisoners in Egyptian jails, most of them Muslim Brotherhood, many of whom have been tortured. And according to Amnesty International, Egypt issued 509 death sentences in the year 2014, the second highest number on record. Now, the number of young people who have been radicalized by these events in Egypt is difficult to measure. To the extent that anecdotal evidence, media reports, and trends on social media are a reflection of a radicalizing trend, it's accurate to state that Egypt under General el-Sisi has become a breeding ground for radical Islamism. Mark Lynch has correctly argued that notwithstanding the Muslim Brotherhood's social conservatism, historically, the Muslim Brotherhood have performed an important role as a firewall against extremism. In other words, the Muslim Brotherhood have been a moderating force within the context of their own societies in terms of pushing back against the trends and the ideological arguments that promote and try to advance extremism. Now, this is a very difficult topic for Americans to understand, particularly my young students, because they view the politics of the Middle East through the prism of liberal democratic politics in societies that have long made a transition to democracy. But within the context of an emerging democracy in the Arab Islamic world, this argument makes perfect sense, and I think it is factually and empirically sustainable. In the past, if you were a politically active Egyptian young person with a religious identity, you could find expression in the public sphere by joining the Muslim Brotherhood and participating in peaceful electoral politics to the extent that they existed. But since the 2013 military coup and the attempt to eradicate the Muslim Brotherhood, this option no longer exists. So effectively, if you are a young person in Egypt today, you have two choices. One, you have to remain silent, shut up, and accept the emerging neo-fascist order under General el-Sisi, or if you are interested in political change, if you're frustrated and angry, you start to entertain options of joining perhaps and entertaining the arguments of some utopian, revolutionary political project that offers the promise of political change. And the one group that, of course, is getting all of the attention, and that at least until recently seemed to be winning political and military victories, is ISIS. There is no third alternative in Egypt today. And tales from Egypt's notorious prison system confirm this argument. Mohammed Sultan, an Egyptian-American student, about 25 years old, was arrested in downtown Cairo in the summer of 2013. He spent 21 months in jail. 16 of those months he was on a hunger strike. And he lost 160 pounds. He risked organ failure. When he emerged from prison, he could not walk. This past summer, the New York Times ran a profile on him where he discussed the torture and brutality that he faced in the Egyptian prison system at the hands of the security services. It's a horrific and shocking story that unfortunately applies to many political prisoners, not only in Egypt, but in the torture chambers of many repressive regimes in the region. But Mohammed Sultan, in his profile, and since coming out, has also revealed something very important about the connection between democracy, authoritarianism, and the rise of radicalism. He's given us details of the political prisoner debates that have taken place in Egyptian prisons. Several of Mohammed Sultan's cellmates were ISIS supporters. Quote, "They walked around with a victorious air," he recalled. They would frequently point to the supporters of the Muslim Brotherhood and state, "Look, you idiots, your model doesn't work." The ISIS supporters would then proceed to make, quote, "very simple arguments, telling us that the world doesn't care about democratic values and only understands violence." He also went on to note that because of the gravity of the situation that we were all in the Egyptian prison system, by the time the ISIS guys were finished speaking, everyone, the liberals, the Brotherhood people, would be left completely speechless. And then he added, when you're in that type of situation and you don't have many options left, for some people, these kind of ideas start to make sense. And so to the extent that this story reflects a trend, and I think it does, there is cause for deep concern. Now, of course, contrasting Egypt under General el-Sisi is the case of Tunisia, the one Arab Spring country that did undergo a successful transition to democracy. And it provides an alternative model to that of Egypt. Rashid Ghannouchi, the leader of Ennahda, has, I think, rightly observed that the only way to truly defeat ISIS is to offer a better product to the millions of young Muslims in the world. And it's called Muslim democracy. He's noted that most young people don't like ISIS. See how many millions flee from it. But they won't accept life under tyrants either. This better product must be a political system that is democratic, that respects human rights, and that gives Islamic values some public space. It's not a coincidence that ISIS has emerged and attracted followers after the crushing of the Arab Spring revolts, highlighting the relationship between democratization and violence. The timing and the sequencing is not accidental. And this formulation of this relationship, which is a common and popular and really indisputable insight into modern politics, was just articulated this morning with Keith Ellison's remarks, quoting President John F. Kennedy in 1962, where he famously and accurately stated that those who make peaceful revolution impossible make violent revolution inevitable. Now, there's more evidence and cases that I could point to. I think the case of Syria, another country that has undergone a revolution as a result of the Arab Spring, highlights this relationship. In the early days, in the early months of the revolution in Syria in 2011, there was no Al-Qaeda. There was no ISIS. There was no Jabhat al-Nusra. There were peaceful protesters chanting non-sectarian slogans, trying to topple a brutal dictatorship, but as a direct result of the closing of the democratic opportunities that opened up and of the brutality of the Assad regime, backed by Russia and Iran, and with the acquiescence of the international community standing on the sidelines, when those doors started to shut, you saw a rapid increase in this peaceful uprising, slowly becoming militarized and then becoming radicalized. And now it's headed into the abyss that is dragging the entire region down with it. One could point to the case of Algeria in the 1990s as well to highlight this relationship. When there was a democratic opening, it looked like there were free and fair elections, but then the old guard in Algeria shut those doors, leading to a horrific civil war that killed approximately 200,000 people, completely destroying the social fabric of Algeria in the process. So the doors of the Arab Spring have closed, and unfortunately, U.S. policy with respect to this development has made things qualitatively worse. A few weeks ago, the Speaker of the U.S. Congress, Paul Ryan, traveled to Egypt with a delegation of other congressmen and women. And as he arrived there, after his meeting with General el-Sisi, he was quoted as saying, "We support democracy in Egypt, and this is why I'm here, to support Egypt's elected parliament and leadership." U.S. Senator Lindsey Graham was there a few days before, and he made similar comments. And if you think this is simply a problem with the Republican Party in this country, think again. The Obama administration, Secretary of State John Kerry, have repeatedly and consistently, since the coup d'etat in Egypt, made similar comments. After the coup d'etat, John Kerry famously or infamously stated that that coup d'etat was leading to a transition to democracy in Egypt. The State Department has continued to stick to that line despite all the evidence to the contrary. I quoted from Bernie Sanders on the left wing of the Democratic Party, who looks at the Middle East and sees only one hero, and that's King Abdullah of Jordan. You know, we can laugh at these statements. We can ridicule them, and I think they should be ridiculed and criticized. But remember, the theme of this conference is the question of radicalization. These statements by leaders of prominent democracies have an effect on the process of radicalization because extremist groups exploit them to their own advantage. And they point to young Muslim and Arab youth and say, look at what's happening. Every political leader of almost every democracy, not only in this country but in Europe, David Cameron, Angela Merkel, Francois Hollande, all of them have embraced General el-Sisi. And so they tell these young kids, is this what you're defending? Is this the democracy that you want? Come over to our side. We have an alternative plan that is not hypocritical and that provides a way forward. So this is the challenge of, I think, dealing with the crisis of the region today. You know, I'm saying these comments at the exact moment when the President of the United States is in Riyadh embracing another dictatorship. And you could be guaranteed the question of democracy or human rights is the last thing on the agenda in that conversation. But we are in the middle of a presidential election, and there is going to be a new president within a few months, and these issues are not going to go away. They're going to continue, I think, to bleed and to corrupt the politics of the Middle East, pushing the region into a radical direction until someone somewhere decides to take a position that these policies that we're pursuing in the Middle East, embracing dictators, have not served us well, and they're coming back to haunt us. And we can see this playing out if you're simply aware and if you're living on the same planet that I am, that the consequences of these policies are now being played out on the streets of Brussels, Paris, San Bernardino, and sadly I'm willing to predict that they're not going to stop there as well. Thank you.